Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay, coming to you from Baltimore. And once a year in Baltimore, the Congressional Progressive Caucus comes for meetings. Not normally open to journalists, but a lot of people from Congress and across the country come to discuss the mostly electoral politics going on in the United States from a supposed progressive point of view. I say supposed because I think a lot of people in the Progressive Congressional Caucus aren't so progressive. At any rate, this year, there is a very interesting delegation that came to this conference from Europe, from progressive and left parties. And it's the first time they've been invited. And they were on panels and engaging with people. And we have the honor of hosting them here. Now joining us in the studio is the Shadow Home Secretary of the UK Labour Party, MP Diane Abbott. Joining us from Germany is the Deputy Chair of the Linke Party, MP Sevim Dardalan. And from Spain, representing the Podemos party, he's a member of Congress there, Eduardo Mara. And from Greece, the head of the International Relations Department of Syriza, which is also now the government of Greece, Yannis Bornous. Sevim, I'm going to start with you. And then we can kind of just jump in and have a conversation here. What effect has the rise of Trump and Trumpian-type politics had on Germany, on the politics of Europe?
Well, in one hand side, it becomes a little bit more difficult in the foreign affairs, in the international politics, to have a predictable US-American policy. For example, in Middle East or on the European issue. And the other hand side is that we do have now almost trade war between Germany and the US. And for example, we, the left party in the German parliament, we do have some understanding on the critics made by Trump on the economy policy of the Germans, because that is what we are criticizing for many years, that we do have more exports worldwide than we have imports, and it's not very well balanced. So it's the same in Europe.
Big trade surplus on Germany's favor.
Exactly, and this is one of the biggest failures of the economy policy in Germany, and this causes the crisis in Europe as well, because we are, exporting the trades in other European countries to the death, actually, and because we are exporting too much outside, and on the other side we have a weak economy in Germany, weak incomes, lower incomes, and that makes the problem. And so on the one side we are having understanding for these critics, but we don't think that is a trade war is the way to have a solution on this problem.
But to be fair to Trump, and this is probably the first time that I'll be fair to him, you said that he's predictable. Actually, what scares British diplomats is he's completely unpredictable, hence this attempt to negotiate with the North Koreans. I mean, what could be more bizarre? How can that end?
Did you mean he was predictable or that he was unpredictable?
The thing is that many people in the German parliament and the government, they say he is not predictable, but I mean, I have to protest on that, because dialogue is the most important thing in the international affairs. Even dialogues with dictators.
I think you're right about dialogue.
Authoritarian regimes.
I think you're right about dialogue, but for the diplomats in Britain and across the world, what is really scary about Trump is that he's wholly unpredictable.
Yeah, that's the main problem, one of the two main problems of the Trump administration, and it seems that it's a reflection of conflicting approaches and analysis within the Trump administration and within the decision-making centers for the US foreign policy. So problem number one is unpredictability. And the second problem, which raises a global discussion actually, is under the spectrum of the failure of the globalized neoliberal capitalist model, this regression of Trump to a new kind of protectionism. And I think that even for the progressive forces, this is a discussion that we have never made in such an extent to produce reliable answers to the people that are waiting to see what would be a progressive answer to this polarization between a failed globalized neoliberal model versus a new kind of protectionism that Trump tries to introduce. So I think that the discussion is open, and in the European field this is becoming very evident, especially having to do with the German exports, as it has been said, and the conflicting interests that the European Union has with the US vis-a-vis the imposition of new taxes in imports, etc., etc.
I would divide this debate into two parts. On one side, it is true that the Trump administration has a foreign policy problem, and that's unpredictability and quite random opinions being spread around the world, to be honest. It's not only about unpredictable. And secondly, I think he's making the domestic agenda in many European countries more conservative because of this protectionist approach. And we are having debates in our own parliaments, which we didn't have 3, 4, or 10 years ago, no matter how Republican the administration in Washington was. And this is something that really matters. It's making things harder for us to get a progressive agenda and to convey a progressive message because of his, Twitter machine abilities, but also because of his own policies. And I think it's a domestic problem as well. Trump is not only an international thing.
But also, I would say, his viscerally anti-immigrant narrative is poisoning the discourse, certainly across the Atlantic.
I want to talk about that a lot, and that's ahead there. But I want to push back a little bit, which is I don't think he's so unpredictable.
Yeah.
And I'm not quite understanding this. When Trump was elected, in his inaugural speech, it was very clear he wanted to target Iran. And if you read around the edges of Trump, meaning Bannon, he talked about a war to defend Western Christian civilization against Islam and China. And I'm not sure how those two things go together, but it's somehow in Bannon and Trump's head they do. And they wanted a rapprochement with Russia, mostly, I think, because they had an energy play they want to do there. But they've been moving in pretty much the direction, I think, that they said they were going to move in.
Well, I totally agree. And the thing is, of course, he has this racist, sexist, and ethnical things, and we condemn it. But the thing is, in the other side, he has a refreshing honesty. I mean, when he says America first, which country does not say German first, Greece first, or Great Britain first? Every country in a capitalist world says my interest first. That's what countries doing, the government's doing, and this is honest, just to do it and to say it.
You may find it refreshing, but when Trump says "Make America Great Again," to me, I read it as wanting to take America back to the 50s. When people of color knew their place.
This is more back to, I think, slave society. I
think
50s is not quite far back enough.
1850s. 1850s. But I don't find that refreshing at all. I find that quite chilling. And again, it infects the European discourse. You've got Trump with that narrative around migration and going backwards, which is vibing in with right-wing parties in Italy, in France and in Germany.
But I really have to say something. Our extreme right problem in Germany is homegrown. It's homegrown.
Oh, yeah.
Because the government in the last 20 years, the government, the Chancellor, Merkel, and the Social Democrats, they have prepared the ground with their war, literally war against the poor and the social welfare state. That's the problem with the right wing in Germany. And the problem is they have urged Europe for an austerity policy, and there is no Trump, the one who is reasonable for that. It's not Washington, it's not Moscow, it's a homegrown problem.
But does the success of Trump And then you have even active organizing, like there's a New York Times piece on Sunday that Steve Bannon's actually in Italy right now, but he's going to speak in France at the National Front meeting.
Long time before Trump, we had this extreme right growing up, rising up parties in France, Front National with Le Pen, or in Austria, they have been in the government in the past even, or in the Netherlands and in some other countries like in the East Europe. And was long before Trump. The thing is not Trump, the thing is the war on the social welfare state, on the social rights, cutting the social rights. This is the ground where the right-wing parties can grow up. And that's the point, not Trump.
But Trump has given it new impetus. That's how it looks from London.
That's true, because on the one hand, nobody can deny that on the surface of the economic crisis in Europe and the degradation of the social rights of the social majorities, the extreme right-wing rhetoric was actually legitimized even by mainstream center-right or even social democratic parties in some cases. But on the other hand, I think that at the same time, nobody can disagree on the fact that when all these forces that carry this rhetoric and they're trying to make it counter-hegemonic in many European states, see this set of values triumph in the US elections, this in qualitative terms offers them a new role in the political game in the respective countries.
Sure.
I mean, the extreme right-wing parties and the populist right-wing parties of Europe are now overlooking to the US, and they're saying to the people, look, America first. Let it be UK first, and here comes the Brexit.
But not only are they looking at Trump saying, look, they're saying America first, but they've been looking at Putin and saying how Putin says Russia first. And there's a lot of links between Russia and the growing right in Europe as well, is there not?
So I think that no one's trying to put the blame on Trump regarding domestic issues. The crisis of the social state has been happening for a long time, very long time, too long. What is true at the same time is that the Trump administration is fueling, it's really feeding a lot of debates that were long gone, at least in Spain. And those are conservative debates. Debates that the Republicans like in the US and debates that the conservatives in Spain like. And those debates, we're not, of course we gotta take a position, but it's not the debates that were happening in taking place in Spain between 2011 and 2015. So I think in terms of setting the agenda, Trump has been bad business for progressives all over the world. But I don't want to put the blame on him for things.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's suggesting that these things originate with Trump.
Case.
The question is, what is the influence of Trump? And I'll say again, of Putin as well, because I think that there's a, certainly reading from here, there's a direct link. Marine Le Pen gets finance from a Russian bank. Then you also have Steve Bannon speaking at a national front. And there's a convergence here of these very right-wing conservative forces, whether they're American or Russian or European, but they're getting organized, more organized, I should say.
Wow.
Let's see it from let's start from a different point of view. It's been already many years that in one way or the other, Russia sees missile shields being installed in many Eastern European countries or even Balkan states overlooking towards Russia. And I don't think that in terms of geopolitical competition, Russians cannot recognize the fact that they will not compete to become the #1 superpower in the planet. They know, I think, their limits, but they're trying to expand their sphere of influence, because how things are turning, we are returning to a discussion about spheres of influence after a long historical period of globalized, interconnected economy and geopolitical interests. It is true, and there are some similarities with the political influence that the Russian administration is trying to obtain in many European states. One similarity with the Trump discourse and the whole political project around Trump is the protection, for example, of Christian values, which is very evident in these populist extremist right-wing parties in Central and Eastern Europe mainly, which is of course accompanied by Islamophobia and xenophobia because of the fact that Europe had and has to face the crisis of refugee flows coming from the war zones of the planet. I think this is an interconnected discussion. It's true that Russia, as a big regional power and one of the biggest global powers, but not number one, is trying to expand its sphere of influence. And it is true that if we see the political developments in a number of European states, there are political forces, there are political parties that are more favorable to a different relation with Russia. Let's see the French presidential election that you already mentioned. Marine Le Pen, or even Mr. Fillon, who comes from the center right and didn't pass to the second round. They were in favor of lifting the sanctions of the European Union against Russia. But we can't blame them for that, in my opinion.
Well, the left does that too, because
yes,
the sanctions are absurd. They are just absurd.
That's why I said we can't blame them, at least for that. And I think it reminds me to the McCarthy area, to just, you know, to for every problem we have, to blame Russia. I mean, I know in our perspective, it looks like that there is a Russophobia in the U.S. going on. Yeah, and but we in Germany, for example, the left, the progressive forces in Germany, we would like to have friendly relation to the Russians, because, first of all, of our history, because of the history, and secondly, we know, especially after 1989, the unity of Germany, we know that security is only with Russia in Europe possible, not against or not without Russia. And that's why we are against the sanctions, we are against the escalation, we are against it that the NATO is going to the west border of Russia, because this doesn't help the people, the population in Europe. We need dialogue, we need a friendship, friendly relations to our neighbors, and that's why I think it's very absurd always blame the Russians for problems we have or the problems homegrown in Germany or in Europe.
Yeah, I think any progressive person would agree with all of that. That doesn't mean that the Russians aren't helping strengthen the far right in
No,
Europe.
of course not.
So
I mean, as Yannis said, every big country, every big force like the US, even the US with the satellite states in Eastern Europe, these are satellite countries for the US, and all the regime change they have done in the east of Europe, the Orange Revolutions, we know that because the US administration, they said openly that they give billions of US dollars to some groups in some countries of the East Europe to change the governments there. It's not a secret. They do it to gain more influence, of course. But I think we in Europe, we have to stand up and say we have different interests than the Russians or than the Americans. Our interest is to have freedom and peace in the European Union and in Europe, and Russia is part of Europe. It's not part of the European Union, but it's part of our continent, Europe, and that's why we need the friendly relations.
I don't think anyone here would disagree with that.
No.
But what I'm getting at is in the rise of the far right in Europe and here, where the far right actually has the White House, and the far right to a large extent is controlling both the Senate and the House, and controlling the majority of state governments in this country. So the far right's in power in the United States. The far right in the United States is encouraging the far right in Europe, as are, I'll say again, the Russians. And there's no doubt, if you want to go a scale of whose footprint is more aggressive. Nobody compares with the United States. But that being said, what is this doing in your country? How is the far right developing? And let me add to that, with the exception of maybe the Labour Party and Syriza in Greece, but to a large extent the left is not taking advantage of this moment as much as the right is.
We
Why?
are taking
I'd say the UK is really an exception.
of this moment. I mean, under the new leadership of the Labour Party, we have adopted a set of left-wing policies. I'm reluctant to default to a Cold War analysis of what's happening with Russia. I'm not saying that Russia isn't trying to intervene, but the sources of the rise of the far right in Europe have more to do with the refugee crisis, which has not been properly addressed, and to do with the fact in the UK, the average income and the average wage has dropped since 1975. There are absolute economic issues that are really at the source of the rise of ordinary working people voting for far-right parties. Yeah. But we have not conceded to this. The last Labour leader, before Tony Blair, before Jeremy Corbyn, the last Labour leader, he had immigration control marks, he made speeches about immigration. We did nothing of that. We led with a principled position on migration and we won seats. We believe it's important to combat that anti-immigrant narrative. That is the way to fight the far right. And it's noticeable the social democratic parties that have given in to right-wing narratives have been decimated in elections across Europe.
But in a country like Spain, for instance, we don't have a far right, an independent far right. Far right is part of the establishment politics. It's part of the Conservative Party. So it's like a section of the Conservative Party.
More or less as it is here now.
Yeah, but the fact is that Conservative Party has lost a lot of support. The traditional parties in Spain, so the Socialist and the Conservative, they used to get 75–80% of the vote in the 90s and in the beginning of the 21st century. And right now, combined, they are polling at 45. So we have took a lot of advantage of the huge wave of discontent with the social cuts, with the war on the wars off that has been taking place for a very long time. The fact is that even if you take advantage, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of organizing on many levels in order to get rid of a two-party system, which is very powerful. It's been there for a very long time, and it's going to take more time. I don't think we're winning. I think we are facing new challenges. Trump is one of these challenges, but also the Russian situation is a new challenge. The situation in Catalonia, when it comes to Spain, is a new challenge. But things have been changing quite quickly. Let's say Syriza in Greece. Of course, there are problems. And we are Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. So there are things going on in Spain, and there are things going on in Europe. Far right is the most dangerous one, but it's not the only one.
And why has Labour on immigration been able to take such a progressive position successfully when in many other countries of Europe, the left seems, from what I can tell, still struggling with the issue, what position to take on immigration?
Because we didn't back off. Because we took on the issues. The truth is that immigration, I mean, there are short-term challenges, but actually migration makes a lot of countries wealthier in the long run. And so we didn't back off, we didn't concede, we didn't conciliate, we didn't have these immigration control mugs. We said we are a socialist party and we will not have immigrants scapegoated for one of the problems with the neoliberal economy. And we didn't back off, we didn't pander, and we won an electoral bonus. Because actually, people that vote for progressive parties, whatever the polling says about the attitudes on immigration, they're looking for leadership. And in London, in Labour, we gave them leadership.
In a country like Spain, for instance, the refugee crisis has been a huge subject of debates, but most people, I'm talking about 65% of the population, are in favor of helping the refugees, and are in favor of having an immigration policy that is up to the task of facing what's going on in the Middle East. And that intersects that's an intersectional thing. I mean, there are conservatives who are taking this approach, as well as people who are progressive. So in a country like Spain, immigrants are not a problem, are not seen as a problem at the moment. It could change.
It's about leadership.
It's not
I
happening.
have visited.
It's because of
I
that.
visited refugee camps in Calais. I visited refugee camps in Lesbos and in the Lebanon. And there's no question that Southern Europe is under a lot of pressure in relation to these immigration issues. But nonetheless, the answer is not to concede to the right. The answer is to stand up for the principles, but also for Europe as a whole to come together and to support the southern European countries.
But may I ask you something? How many refugees did Great Britain welcome in the last 2 years? When the refugee crisis started with Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, how many people came into Great Britain?
The Conservative government's record is poor, and I've stood up in Parliament and said, why haven't we taken more? Particularly, why haven't we taken more from the camps? And I repeat, I think what needs to happen is that southern Mediterranean countries, notably Italy and Greece, and perhaps to a certain extent Spain, they need more support from Europe as a whole. But what you mustn't do, what you can't do, is pander to generalised anti-immigrant feeling, because that anti-immigrant feeling more reflects economic pressures and the downturn in ordinary people's incomes. You know, the right-wing parties want to blame immigrants for the problems caused to working people.
We
refuse to do that.
Well, in Greece, the rise of the extreme right in the face of the neo-fascist party of the Golden Dawn began long before the outburst of the refugee crisis, with the huge refugee flows coming from the wider region of Syria and Iraq. By the way, since you asked about the number of refugees that went to the UK, in Greece we had the experience in 2015 of seeing more than 1.5 million refugees arriving and crossing through our country.
Yeah.
For a country of 11 million, which has lost 24% of its GDP in only the first 2 years of the crisis, you can imagine how dramatic this was. But fortunately, we had an amazing collaboration, a historical phenomenon, an amazing collaboration of the official state with NGOs, with local citizens' initiatives, with people who got self-organized even in the islands where the boats were arriving. And we managed to do our best under the specific circumstances that prevail in our country. But let me get back to my first sentence. The Golden Dawn, this neo-Nazi party in Greece, did not manage to win institutional representation in the Greek and then in the European Parliament because of the refugee flows. It happened 3 years before. And this happened under the environment of this dramatic economic crisis, which suppressed the popular classes and the middle classes. I told you that we lost 24% of our GDP in 2 years. In times of peace, this has never happened. Only in cases of countries who were under war. And with this crisis, the underlying crisis of political representation that was going on for many years exploded with the emergence of anti-systemic, anti-establishment political parties. Fortunately, in Greece, the majority of the people who decided to vote for anti-establishment parties was influenced by the proposal of Syriza for unity in order to gain power, from the proposal of a progressive political party. But surely there was a minority of these people who were disenfranchised by the whole situation that voted for the Golden Dawn, voted for an openly neo-Nazi party who is now under trial even for murders, for human trafficking, weapon trafficking, for steroids trafficking in gyms, for offering protection to shops, to shop owners, etc., etc., a criminal gang. So then when the refugee crisis came to Greece, and we had this unbelievable outburst. I come from Lesbos, you mentioned Lesbos.
Yes,
I come from an island that has 87,000 inhabitants and received the vast majority of this 1.5 million in 2015, 2016. I cannot even describe the situations that the Greek people experienced. And I think despite the current serious problems, the Greek people have managed to portray that there is a different way to treat this kind of crisis, the way of solidarity, the way of cooperation, the fact that all immigrant children are now going to schools in Greece, from the immigrants that finally stayed in Greece, which are approximately 70 to 75,000.
What is Syriza's policy now in terms of new refugees, new immigrants? What is the policy?
So let me start from the domestic level. We have around 70 to 75,000 people who stayed in Greece and waiting for their asylum applications to be determined, etc., etc. For all those people who stayed in Greece, they are either hosted in camps. In 2 or 3 of the islands, we still have problems in the camps, but the majority of them is living under decent conditions, and many thousands of them are living already in flats through special programs founded by the Greek state and by the European Union. And all the children of refugees are now going to Greek schools. And this is very important because we know that a part of them will stay in Greece. So we need to incorporate these people to show them that they can build their lives again to these people coming from war zones. The big problem is the European policy. There is a deal between European Union and Turkey. At the same time, there was a European agreement for the relocation of refugees and immigrants arriving in Italy and Greece.
Didn't work out.
And it didn't work out because there are many European Union states who
not
never applied the relocation agreement.
Because the European states are not delivering.
For
Particularly
example,
in Eastern Europe.
For example, the Visegrad country in Central and Eastern Europe who refused to apply this relocation deal, or many Balkan states who closed the borders. The European Union didn't show any leadership.
No,
according to the Lisbon Treaty, which the European left parties didn't vote for, there is a prediction for sanctions against member states who unilaterally violate this kind of decisions. But there was no punishment, there was no reaction towards the fact that a number of European states refused to host even one immigrant or refugee.
For instance,
and that reproduces the problem for Italy and Greece.
Just a couple of things. Firstly, the record of most European countries is very poor when it comes to welcoming refugees and relocating refugees, very poor. Spain, I think it took the compromise of welcoming like 15,000 refugees, and it's only been 1,000, maybe 2,000. So it's we are underperforming. But there's something you said. You made a point. I think I can try to depart from it in order to summarize this discussion. You can divide, it's not the only aspect, not the only side to it, but you can divide Europe into 2 kinds of countries. Because there's been a huge wave of anti-establishment feelings in all over Europe. But you can divide countries into 2 different kinds. The ones that had anti-establishment left-wing parties.
Exactly.
And the ones that had anti-establishment right-wing parties. So the UK got UKIP and you got Brexit. You got Alternative für Deutschland.
We also had the Labour Party.
Yeah.
In Britain, there was a huge surge of anti-establishment feeling, but it led to people voting in a completely unprecedented and unpredicted way for the Labour Party. And just to say about Greece, I visited Lesbos, I visited the refugee camps, and it's a huge challenge for Greece. But I must say, I was impressed by, even despite with all the challenges, ordinary Greek people on Lesbos wanted to do their best. And that speaks well for the Greeks, who didn't get the support from the rest of the EU.
The amount of refugee crisis we've seen is probably not even a thimble of what's coming. The climate crisis is going to create a refugee migration movement that's going to make the current situation look small. So let me ask all of you, what does a progressive immigration policy look like in a world, especially in Europe, where there's going to be waves and waves of people wanting to get away from devastated lands, whether it's in Africa or other parts of the world?
It demands more European cooperation. It's not easy, but it's totally unfair that countries like Greece and Italy should have to bear the brunt. And really the Eastern European countries and the Balkan countries, they need to step up. What is the point of an EU if it cannot impose its own rules in terms of burden sharing, in terms of migrants? Whether Britain is in the EU or not, I will be arguing, and Jeremy Corbyn will be arguing, for better European cooperation. It's totally unfair to Greece and Italy to have bared the burden that they should. And also, so it's about European cooperation, but it's also about recognising that these migrants are people, and just putting up barbed wire and hoping they'll drown in the Mediterranean is no answer to anything.
Germany's taken in a lot of, especially compared to some other countries.
From 1.1 million, we got 1 million.
So what is the Linke's policy,
Yeah.
not towards just the people that are there already, but the many, many more that want to come?
I mean, yeah, we have worldwide 65 million people who are migrating and fleeing. And our point of view is we have to stop with the root causes of migration and refugees. We have to fight for the right not to migrate, not to flee. This is a very, like to strengthen the self-determination, the right of self-determination of the people, not to forced to flee and leave the country, their home country, their homes, their families. And this is, I think this is progressive policy, to help the people to stay in their houses, in their home countries. And
but what does that mean in terms of policy,
that means we need fair trade and not the trade policy we have that is neoliberal and not fair. This is destroying the existences of millions of people, like the agriculture in Africa. And we say we have to stop with a regime change policy, with military interventions, and we have to stop the arms exports, like the selling of arms and guns worldwide. Every country which is selling guns and arms, these arms are coming with like a refugee back to us. So every arm is actually a refugee, and you're causing this. So we have to fight the root causes of migration and the fleeing of million people. And within the country, in Germany, as interior affairs, we have to make a social integration policy, not just welcoming 1 million people like the Chancellor Merkel did, no houses, no schools, no kindergarten places, no jobs. This is really, I mean, this is the ground where the right-wing parties are growing and rising up. This increase them. That's the problem in Germany, why we do have such a right-wing party now so strongly in the German parliament. The government, they are caused these far-right parties because they said refugees okay, because they are reasonable for that the people had to flee from Syria because of their regime change policies. And but they didn't do anything in a social integration policy in Germany. And that's the problem with what we have. And this is homegrown. This is not caused by Washington or Moscow. It's caused by their own problems and policies.
We also have to distinguish between refugees, people who are refugees under the various European conventions, like the people from Syria, and economic migrants, who are the people crossing Libya, crossing the Mediterranean, and coming to Europe. We all have, as nation states, a legal responsibility to people who are literally, legally refugees and asylum seekers. But the things you're talking about making it more feasible for people to stay in their country of origin, is about the economic migrants. I think it's dangerous to conflate the two things.
No.
People that are fleeing war.
Thanks for the distinction.
But it's a legal distinction.
Yes, of course.
Because all of us as European countries
but we have
a legal responsibility to refugees and asylum seekers.
Yes, I know.
But economic migration is different.
Yeah,
and it's really important to understand the difference.
Yes, we have a different opinion on that. Because
not an opinion, it's the law. It's the European Convention. What do you mean,
Yeah.
opinion? What
No,
if
it's
there
the
is no
European.
opinion
No.
about people that are fleeing war? This was set in European conventions after the Second World War. It's not whether my opinion is Syrians are
Yes,
fleeing
I
war
mean
or
in the
your
migration
opinion.
of economic.
Yeah,
There is
well,
no
let's-
law in
let's-
the European Union of economical
That's
migration.
my
It's a blue
point.
card and so. But
That's
we
my
have
point. We have
yeah,
to distinguish
Yes.
between refugees and economic
But
But
migration.
once you
we say-
distinguish, the question I'm raising is there's already been a great deal of refugee migration to Germany, but there's an enormous amount, you can call it economic migration. It's already there really, but it's going to come at a scale that's unprecedented as climate change starts to have its consequences.
Yeah, but at the same
What is a
time-
progressive position towards the millions of people that will be not fleeing war, but they could be fleeing catastrophes, climate-caused catastrophes? What will be a progressive position towards that?
We also need to reconsider when we're discussing about long-term challenges, we should also consider from another point of view the aging of Europe.
Yeah.
The demographics
The,
of
the
the-
demographic crisis of the European Union, which is enormous. And we can see it in our country and I think in every country. We need to talk about the categories of labor that these people come to cover. And or the terms of exploitation by the bosses, by the big businesses. It's a whole set of programmatic struggle, but also activist struggle in order to win against these policies that have exploited all these waves of refugees of war, but also economic migrants. I couldn't agree more concerning, for example, the agricultural sector. The European Union has formed the so-called European Partnership Agreements, especially with many North African states. If you see the conditions, they're not allowing the farmers and the fishermen in these countries to survive with their own through their own work. So many of, for example, fishermen from Somalia, they climbed on boats and tried to pass to Spain in the previous years. And this is a very concrete political struggle, for example, in the European Union, to modify the partnership agreements of the European Union with third countries in order not to exploit these populations. But on the other hand, there is a concrete reality, and this is the situation in the Middle East. After a long period of destabilization caused by many imperialist forces, for example, nobody knows who's really governing in Libya.
Nobody.
I mean,
Let me go
So-
back. Let me just focus
may I
it again.
add
Where,
something?
yeah, go ahead.
For us, the problem with the brain drain is highly problematic. For example, in Germany, the far-right parties, they are coming along with the economical selection migration policy in Canada or in Australia. They are very coming along with it because they say it fits to our racism of utility, that we need people for these and these jobs. Then if they're doing this qualification, it's good. If not, the other one can die in the Mediterranean. You know, this utility
buy your way,
racism on this brain drain, and to get the high qualified persons in some African countries or somewhere else, to get them into the European states to work for them, for the society there. We found it very highly problematic because firstly it supports this utility racism, that people are just worth to live and to stay because they do something, they work as something, and the other ones are not worthy. And secondly, it's a mess for the countries, for the home countries of these people, to lose this qualified or high qualified, middle qualified personnel, because they need them for their own countries. And that was, for example, a few years ago in Germany, we had this discussion for the IT people to get them from India. And the Indian Prime Minister said, no, stop it. We don't send them to Germany because we need our brain here to develop our own country. And this is, I think this is good and fair enough.
What I'm getting at, in the current situation, as I'm suggesting, it's going to get a lot worse. Progressive labor parties are going to have to put limits on immigration. And they're going to have to message what those limits are. I mean, I would think, in terms of going back what you were saying earlier about actually dealing with some of the why can't people stay where they are issues, the fact that climate is not at the higher on all the political agendas, and of course in this country it's the worst, it's not even on the political agenda, climate change. In Canada, a modicum better, but not really. The federal government in Canada is approving and pushing more pipelines out of the tar sands. But we're facing an existential crisis, both in terms of climate and both in terms of what it's going to mean for life on the planet in general, and it's not being talked about like that in many places. And the migration problem is going to be enormous. So, and how progressive parties deal with it and message it is going to have a lot to do with what happens with the development of the far right. Because this is all going to be, the right is going to say, zero, don't let anybody in. And they don't even want to say there's a climate crisis.
Yeah, but we've challenged the far right in Britain, and that's worked for us. And you also, because you're saying that it's a refugee and an immigration crisis.
Migration.
Right, it's a migration crisis. I think that when it comes to actual refugees and asylum seekers, the law is clear.
The law is clear.
Yeah, but it's not so much a crisis of economic migrants, it is a crisis of European countries living up to their responsibilities. And I return to the importance of making all EU countries, including Eastern Europe, including the Balkans, play their part and not having an undue burden fall on southern European countries.
I get it, but what is the Labour Party's position on how many new immigrants will be allowed?
We don't
into
believe
the UK?
in bogus targets. Year after year, the Tories have said they're going to keep migration to tens of thousands. Every year they fail to meet their targets. We don't believe in bogus targets. We believe in managing migration. We believe in treating migrants like human beings. The target approach does not work. It's just a way of pandering to people's fear of migrants. And when people in the UK say, oh, it's all these immigrants, pressure on housing, pressure on the health service, without migrants, Britain's health service would be in a terrible state. We in the Labour Party in Britain do not believe in bogus targets. We believe in better European cooperation on the issue, and we believe in the fair and reasonable management of migration and taking some of the pressure.
But define fair and reasonable. What does that mean?
Well, things like family reunion. What you've got in Europe is children crossing Europe and then finding it impossible to have their families join them. Fairness for us is about family reunion, whether it's children who've made their way to Britain or France or whatever, being able to have their parents join them, or parents who've made their way to Britain being able to let their children join them. That's what we mean by fair. Family reunion is the right thing, because actually if you're interested in integration, if people have their families with them, they're more likely to integrate properly.
European solidarity in practice means that there can be no Polish government refusing to receive even one refugee or immigrant and calling them the new cholera in Europe.
Yes.
The European Union leadership in this case should impose sanctions.
Yeah.
If you don't apply the relocation, the reunification of families programs, then you cannot be in the European Union. Why are you in the European Union? Why are you in a union of states? Only to gain benefits, like for example, all the new states that are entering the European Union and getting structural funds, agricultural funds, etc., etc. This is the notion of European unification, because until now the neoliberal majority in the European Union leadership has been brutal and authoritarian when we're talking about fiscal and financial policies of the member states of the Eurozone, for example, and my country has bitterly experienced that. It has been politically punished because we have been trying to change the paradigm. So what about this case? this is not only a European but a global challenge, and I agree with you that with the consequences of climate change, with the continuation of imperialist interventions, with the continuation of wars, with the continuation of this European Partnership Agreement in terms of agriculture, we're going to continue receiving refugees and economic migrants.
Yeah.
So the question, and I agree with Diane, is the management. And when we're talking about the management of this crisis, we have to talk about European solidarity. If there's not such thing, then what's the point of discussing about any kind of European integration model?
Okay, so in the next segment, we're going to talk about Brexit, what you all think of it, because that sure ain't European integration model. So please join us for a continuation of our discussion with our esteemed panel from Europe on the Real News Network.